In this week's lecture, I wanted to introduce a couple of other notions about learning and technology and the role that it might play in schools. And one of the things that I want you to think about as you work your way through this particular lecture, and whilst you're on placement over the next 4 years, is to think about the implications of the ideas I'm going to present in this lecture for your own teaching practice. What implications might there be for how you design learning experiences for your students? What impediments might there be to adopting the sorts of ideas that I'm going to present to you based around the philosophy or the theory of constructionism and the maker movement? A lot of the ideas that I am raising in this lecture originate with one of my heroes of education theory, and that's a gentleman by the name of Seymour Papert. Seymour Papert worked very closely as a student and a colleague with Jean Piaget, who is considered one of the leading thinkers in psychology, and particularly educational psychology, and whose work is the basis for much of how we think about learning today. But Papert, post his time with Piaget, became quite disillusioned and remains very disillusioned with the way school is done. Papert echoes some of the ideas that I raised in the last lecture on connectivism, that there is a gap, a growing gap, between the directions taken by society and those taken by schools. Papert argues that this is one of the reasons that students, young people, are becoming more disengaged when at school. They feel that school is out of sync with the rest of the world, and they struggle to find the relevance of what we as teachers ask them to do. And so this is one of the big challenges he sees. Papert is quite scathing at times about the role of schools. He argues that they do a terribly damaging job of teaching children to be infantile, dependent, intellectually dishonest, passive and disrespectful to their own developmental capacities, and goes on to argue that every time we teach something, we deprive students of the pleasure and the benefits of discovery. He goes on to argue that our role as teachers, as I have argued previously with you, is to design experiences where our students can learn. Only the learner can actually learn. We can't control that. As teachers, the best that we can do is create those conditions where children can learn. And Papert takes that further and talks about conditions for invention. And that idea of invention is one that will recur throughout this particular lecture. Before we get to constructionism as a theory of learning, I think it's really important that you understand its genealogy. And it's grounded, not surprisingly, in the work of Piaget around cognitive constructivism. And I want to just concentrate over here for now. Under the constructivist theory of learning, the idea is that the learner develops schema to represent concepts that they understand. And that, excuse me, that when a new experience takes place that contradicts the existing schema that we have this disequilibrium, or what Piaget referred to as cognitive dissonance. It's when your brain kind of freezes and you go, that's not what I thought happened. And I'm sure that you can think of concepts that you believed in as a young child and that were quite surprised when some of those things didn't play out in reality. One of the common misconceptions that young children have is that every four-legged animal is a dog. And the look of puzzlement on a young child's face when you point out that no, that's not a dog. It might have a head, 4 legs and a tail, but it's a horse. And you can see that puzzlement, and that's when you're having dissonance, and the child has to assimilate this new idea, this new information, and accommodate for it by readjusting their schema so that everything inside the brain is back in equilibrium. That's the idea of constructivism. We construct that meaning for ourselves. And it's based on these principles that learning is an active rather than a passive process, and learning should be whole, authentic, and real. So these ideas about authentic learning, active learning, relevant learning are grounded in work done almost a century ago by Piaget. These ideas form the basis of much of the rhetoric around learning and teaching that we see in the school sector today. But in my view, particularly the focus of how learning and teaching is done in primary schools, more so than in secondary schools. The next stage is the idea of social constructivism that the great Russian educational psychologist Lev Vygotsky wrote about. One of the interesting things, though, is that the Western world didn't get to hear about Vygotsky's theories until after he died, because of the curtain that was brought down on Soviet Russia in the 20th century. So the idea of social constructivism is that it builds on Piaget's cognitive constructivism but brings in a social element. It really argues that we learn best when we're learning with and from each other, and that language is the tool that we need in order to make sense of the experiences that we are sharing with others, and that without language, learning is fairly near impossible. And Vygotsky went on to argue that we can have a more knowledgeable other. In many cases, educators assume that that's the teacher, but it could just be another student in a classroom. And that through the ideas of scaffolding, that word that you'll keep hearing, of tutoring, we can assist a less knowledgeable other to learn. And this is a term that you might hear as well, the zone of proximal development. And that's the gap that exists between where we are now as a learner and where we might be with the help of a more knowledgeable other. So both of these theories, one which is built on the other, are talking about how we as individuals construct meaning mentally, and they argue that that's the process of learning. In last week's lecture, Siemens and Downs kind of start to move away from this and say that learning doesn't happen within our brain, learning happens within the network. Quite an extension to this idea. I'm now going to turn to the ideas around constructionism. In this quote, Papert defines what he means by constructionism, and he sees it as a joining of two areas. From constructivist theories of psychology, we take the view that learning is a reconstruction rather than a transmission of knowledge. So we assimilate and accommodate and rejig those schema that we create that help us make sense of the world. It's not a simple question of opening our brains up, having somebody else pour in information and shut our brains and everything's okay. It's a process of reconstructing and reconfiguring how we see the world, the meaning that we make from the world. So Papert starts with a constructivist notion, but extends that idea to that idea that learning is most effective when the learner experiences the construction of a meaningful product. So he takes it to another level, that we most effectively change those schema when we're constructing, when we're making something. And that's the core of constructionism. Let's work our way through these 8 key ideas, 8 big ideas around constructionism. The first of those over here is that we learn by doing, and that reflects back to theories put forward by Piaget and Dewey and Jerome Bruner around the importance of active learning, of hands-on learning, experiential learning. Papert then goes on to argue that technology is a building material, that the power of computing lies in its capacity to help us create things. This is another really key idea over here. The best fun is fun that is hard, where there is a challenge. I'm linking back to the idea in a previous slide about Lev Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, and what I talk about in Introduction to Educational Settings, where learning environments need to provide a challenge. If things are too easy, we don't engage. If they are too hard, if they are beyond our zone of proximal development, then we don't engage. But if it's too easy, it's no joy. If something is hard for us to learn, then when we master it, when we achieve that learning goal, then the sense of self-efficacy is really high, that leads to higher levels of motivation to continue to learn. That's where we as teachers need to be designing our learning activities, where the fun in learning is hard. Papert then goes on to talk about how we need to learn. And he talks here about the importance of metacognition, about thinking about how we're learning, about thinking about what we're learning, thinking about how we're thinking. He then argues, number 5 is up here, that we need in the classrooms to give proper time for our students to engage in this hard fun using technology to do things. Importantly, this is really important, we need to fail up. One of the ideas that Papert and his co-researchers talk about is the notion of tinkering, that we need to explore how things work by creating something, and that it's okay to fail, because it's in that failure that we need to figure out where we went wrong. In computer terminology, Papert talks about the need to debug the program. So when he's talking about using technology, he's talking about writing programs for computers. And if the computer doesn't do what we expect it to do, then there's something wrong with the program. We need to go back and debug it. And that's a metaphor that can be applied to non-technology modes of learning as well. And it doesn't have to be computer programming. It could be creating a video, editing the video. It could be creating something out of any of the programs and applications that you're all exploring at the moment. What happens when it doesn't work? We need to unpack why it doesn't work. We're engaging then in problem solving. Papert also talks about the importance of risk-taking, and for us as teachers to model that risk-taking. One of the fears that some of you might be experiencing, or your mentor teachers might be experiencing, is the fear of the student knowing more than you do. When it comes to technology, let go the fear. Model that risk-taking. Oh, I'm not quite sure how this works. Let's try it together. What happens if we do this? And in that way, you're saying to the students, it's okay to try. It's okay to explore and to tinker and to see what happens. And finally, Papert talks about this idea of digital literacy, understanding how technology can help us achieve the sorts of learning outcomes that we have. Well, that's constructionism in a little bit of a nutshell. I want to briefly return to this notion that Papert put forward about hard fun. And it comes from computer games, not surprisingly. And this is really important down here. Kids mean it's fun because it's hard. It's fun in spite of being hard. Learning is essentially hard. And it happens when you are deeply engaged in hard and challenging activities. And this is at the core of game design. Really good games computer games are not easy to succeed at. They actually provide a challenge, but an achievable challenge. And that's a core element of any game design. It should also be a core element of any design of learning experiences. And I tend to agree with Papert down here. There's a preoccupation of making it easy. But what happens when we do that? That's the question I want you to think about when you're on placement. And by the time you've got through this far of the lecture, you might be hearing some familiar stories or some familiar messages. These are the sorts of messages I hope that I've been conveying as this course has unfolded. The role of the teacher is to create the conditions for invention rather than providing ready-made knowledge. One of the things I often talk to my students about is to resist the urge to tell our students everything. Let them discover. Create opportunities and experiences where they can discover for themselves and construct meaning for themselves. Your role is to guide them through that so that they're not gaining a misconception or a misunderstanding, but that they come to those understandings themselves. Building from Papert's notion of constructionism, where learning happens when we are actively involved in the construction of an object, be that a real object made of atoms or a virtual object made of bytes, comes the maker movement. This movement did not originate in education, but is starting to flow through to education. And I see it as an enactment of constructionism. Before I move on to talking about the maker movement in the classroom, I want you to think a little bit about, I want to introduce you to the ideas of making. And it's interesting, Mitch Resnick, and I've given you a link to a reasonably long video that Mitch has produced around ideas of constructionism and the maker movement. Just as an aside, Mitch worked with Seymour Papert at MIT Media Lab for many years and has taken Seymour Papert's ideas and extended them into a whole range of areas, but based around this notion of constructionism. So here's a graphic that kind of talks about the elements of the maker movement. And here's that word again. If I draw your attention over here to number 1, it's about tinkering, taking the familiar and using it in unfamiliar ways. So playing around with it, thinking laterally, trying to come up with ideas about making something that's a little bit different. He talks here about it's about the process, free yourself and experiment. And it's that idea of experimentation that we want to foster in our classrooms around creativity and sharing. I'm not quite sure where I'm going now. Second, the spirit of the maker. It's okay to be imperfect, and that's a really important message to give our young people in our classrooms. It's okay to not be perfect. It's okay, in fact, it's more than okay to explore and try and tinker and twist. And to be creative. It's about remixing that idea of looking at something in an unfamiliar way. Take another idea and build on top of it. Add your own voice in it. Remix. Make your mark. So one of the things that you might like to look at is a YouTube video on Kane's Arcade. A little 9-year-old, 10-year-old boy spent a summer in his dad's workshop building a fun arcade, an amusement arcade, out of cardboard boxes and bits and pieces. The epitome of the maker movement, and it's a really uplifting and joyous story. But it's about making your mark in the world. Ideas can be expressed in many different ways, and people in the maker movement are characterized by this notion of disruption. They're looking at new ways of inventing and creating, ways that improve on what large-scale manufacturing do, coming up with unique ideas, niche ideas. And to me, I think also to the world of employment, that's a really important characteristic for us to be fostering amongst our young people. Engage, foster creativity, create and share, do all this collaboratively. So that's kind of the idea behind the Maker movement, and I've also given you a link on our course website to a 2.5 minute brief YouTube video that introduces the Maker movement, and I'm urging you to go and have a look at that. It won't take you very long. Mitch Resnick talks about the role of play and tinkering in kindergarten. Our early childhood centres are full of chances for young children to tinker and to play and to make. Why do we remove that from schools as our children, our young people get older? The Maker movement is pushing to reverse this trend and reintroduce spaces and time in our schools for young people to explore, to invent, to create, to try, to make mistakes, to modify and to try again. Why? Because from this process they learn. They follow their interests, they investigate, they experiment and explore, they problem solve, often in the company and with others. They integrate technologies such as computers, 3D printers, electronic circuits, robots, programming. They develop and create interest in science, in engineering, maths and technology. And maker spaces are pretty wonderful for fostering learning in the STEM areas, so science, technology, engineering and maths, which is a huge push in much of the Western world at the moment. But making doesn't have to just be the purview of STEM subjects. Making a video, making an online publication. Think of all of the applications that we've been exploring in our digital sandpit in this course, and think about the opportunities that they afford our young people to construct something, to make something, to explore and to tinker with those applications. And in that process, a huge amount of learning takes place. Another one of Seymour Papin's disciples is a gentleman by the name of Gary Steger, and he, together with Sylvie Martinez, have written a book called Invent to Learn, Making, Tinkering and Engineering in the Classroom. And this book is all about how to transfer the maker movement into the classroom. And Steger and Martinez talk about maker classrooms as active classrooms, getting back to those theories of constructivism and constructionism, where we find students who are really engaged, working on different projects simultaneously, teachers unafraid of relinquishing their authoritarian role. So there's an implication for your own teaching practice. How much of the control do you take? How much of the responsibility for the learning experience do you transfer to the students? The best way to activate your classroom is for your classroom to make something. Gary Steger has talked for a number of years about the importance of this approach, and it grew out of work that he and Papin did in a juvenile detention centre in the state of Maine in the United States of America. And they worked with young offenders who resisted traditional forms of schooling to get them to build things, get them to create things using a combination of toys, robots, machines, computers, and other materials. Constructionism in action, if you like. And what they found was these young juvenile offenders who had very limited education up until that point became effective learners, particularly when they were working on building things in which they had an interest. And sometimes those things were around science and engineering principles, around looking at physics, around trucks and gravity and force. But sometimes those things that they created were Shakespearean plays brought to life in a modern context. So the maker movement in education is not just about STEM subjects. It can be about history, it can be about language, it can involve arts and should involve arts. One of the points that Martinez and Steger make is that this learning by doing approach builds on students' natural inclinations to learn through the doing of things. And the maker movement, values that capability, the ability to make things happen and to solve problems anywhere and any time. Another point that Steger and Martinez make is that constructive technology is now far more affordable than it has been. And they don't talk about constructive technology necessarily as being very expensive and very big things, although 3D printers are a feature of the maker movement in schools. The combination of robotics and microprocessors and smart materials and new programming languages really help. But maker movement doesn't have to include just technology stuff. And because these things are now so affordable, children of all ages can use the tools to be real-world makers, not just the passive receivers of information that as teachers we push at them, but they're constructing, and in the construction of these objects that they design and create, they're learning a whole stack of things. My son and I were talking about his passion when he was in primary school about trebuchets. They're like the old-fashioned war catapults of the medieval times. And how in the making of a model trebuchet, and perhaps the redesigning of a trebuchet, the sorts of learning that could be integrated with that could involve a lot of physics around gravity, force, friction, motion, a lot of mathematics around notions of resistance and arcs and measurement and angles. So huge amounts of science and mathematics and engineering in terms of how you actually put something together. But we also argued that you could bring in a lot of historical understanding around why were trebuchets in fact invented. Here are a couple of questions for you to consider whilst you're on placement over the next 4 weeks. What opportunities can you generate in your own teaching for your students to create and construct things, be they physical material things, be they purely technological things, or be they the end result of a combination of technology and materials? What sort of learning do you see? What is the impact on your students' engagement when you observe them in such an environment, in such a space? The other thing to think about is what impedes your ability to do this. One of the really big impediments that Papert talked about was the curriculum. He advocates throwing the entire curriculum out. I'm not sure that I would go quite so far. He was quite a radical bloke, let's face it. But throw it out and base your curriculum around students' interest and get them to create things. What else might impede your ability to do this? What sort of structures and ways of doing things are entrenched in the schools in which you are placed? What are the attitudes of the teachers around you to transmissive pedagogies compared to constructivist or constructionist pedagogies? Have a think about those sorts of things, and we'll resume our conversation around these issues when you return in 5 weeks.